There was a moment in 1944 when the war in Europe stopped being a distant nightmare and became a direct march toward the heart of Nazi Germany. On June 6th, more than 150,000 Allied soldiers crossed the English Channel and stormed the coast of France in one of the largest military operations ever attempted. Among them were thousands of American soldiers who knew that they were not simply landing on a beach. They were stepping into the most dangerous fight of their lives against an enemy that had conquered much of Europe and had spent years preparing to stop an Allied invasion. The world was watching. Europe was waiting. And somewhere beyond those beaches stood the German war machine. What happened next would help change the course of the war forever. The Second World War had already devastated much of the world by the time America entered the conflict. Germany had invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, beginning a conflict that would eventually claim an estimated 55 million lives. German forces swept through Western Europe in 1940, while Britain fought back in the skies during the Battle of Britain. In June 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union, opening an enormous Eastern Front. Then on December 7th, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The attack brought the United States directly into the war, joining Britain and the Soviet Union against Nazi Germany and the other Axis powers. From that moment forward, American industry, soldiers, aircraft, ships, and military power would become part of a gigantic Allied effort to defeat the Axis. But America did not enter a war that could be won overnight. Germany was still a formidable military power, and the fighting stretched across continents. In the East, German armies had pushed deep into Soviet territory before a massive Soviet counterattack in December 1941. In 1942, German forces launched another major offensive towards Stalingrad and the oil fields of the Caucasus, but the offensive eventually stalled. In November, Soviet forces counterattacked at Stalingrad, and on February 2nd, 1943, the German Sixth Army surrendered. Later that year, Germany attempted another major offensive at Kursk, described in the source as the largest tank battle in history, but Soviet forces defeated the attack and gained a military advantage they would maintain until the end of the war. Meanwhile, the Western Allies were beginning to push back from the south. In July 1943, Allied forces landed in Sicily. By September, they had entered mainland Italy, forcing the Italian government to negotiate a surrender with Anglo-American forces. German troops then took control of northern Italy and continued fighting. Mussolini was rescued by German SS commandos and installed as the head of a Nazi-backed regime in northern Italy. The German forces there would continue resisting until May 1945. The war was becoming a gigantic pressure campaign. Germany was being attacked from multiple directions, but the decisive confrontation in Western Europe was still waiting. Then came June 6, 1944. The Allied invasion of Normandy began. More than 150,000 Allied soldiers landed on the French coast as part of an enormous military operation. American troops were among the forces moving inland, fighting their way through France while facing German resistance. The objective was not simply to capture a beach. The objective was to establish a massive Allied foothold in Western Europe and begin the liberation of France. By the end of August, France had been liberated, and the Allied armies were no longer fighting simply to push Germany back. They were moving toward Germany itself. On September 11, 1944, the first American troops entered Germany, about a month after Soviet forces had already crossed the German frontier from the east. The German military was now being squeezed from both directions. Yet Germany was not finished. In December, German forces launched a counterattack in Belgium and northern France in an attempt to reverse the Allied advance. The offensive failed, but it demonstrated that the German army could still strike back. The war remained deadly, and victory was still not guaranteed. Allied aircraft continued bombing German industrial installations, while ground forces kept advancing. Then, in early 1945, the German position began collapsing. Soviet forces launched another major offensive on January 12th, liberating Western Poland and forcing Hungary to surrender. American forces continued their advance in the west, and on March 7th, American troops crossed the Rhine River. This was a crucial moment. The Rhine had long been one of the great natural barriers protecting Germany, yet American soldiers had crossed it and were now pushing deeper into German territory. From the east, Soviet forces were advancing toward Berlin. From the west, American and Allied forces were closing in. The Nazi regime was being surrounded. By April, the end was approaching rapidly. Soviet forces surrounded Berlin, while the Western Allies continued their advance through Germany. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide as Soviet forces fought their way toward the Reich Chancellery. Just days later, Germany surrendered unconditionally to the Western Allied forces at Reims on May 7th. In Berlin, Germany capitulated to the Soviets on May 9th. After nearly 6 years of war, Nazi Germany had fallen. But the Second World War was not over yet. The fighting continued in the Pacific until August 1945, when the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The attacks killed an estimated 120,000 civilians instantly, according to the source, and Japan officially surrendered on September 2nd. The most destructive conflict in human history had finally come to an end. For the American soldiers who crossed the beaches of Normandy, pushed through France, entered Germany, and crossed the Rhine, the significance of those events could not have been fully understood in the moment. They were young men moving through smoke, fear, and chaos, fighting an enemy that had dominated Europe for years. They could not know exactly how the story would end, but they kept moving forward. And alongside British, Canadian, Soviet, and other Allied forces, their advance helped bring the Nazi regime to its final days. The beaches of Normandy were not the end of the war. They were the beginning of the final march toward Germany. Today, the photographs of those soldiers can make the distance between then and now feel enormous. But behind every photograph was a human being who had stepped into history. They landed on a hostile coast, survived the fighting, crossed a continent at war, and eventually stood inside the country that had unleashed the conflict. They did not know how many of their friends would make it home. They did not know how long the war would last. They only knew that they had a job to do. And by the spring of 1945, the armies that had landed in Europe less than a year earlier were standing on German soil as the Nazi regime collapsed around them. This was the road from Normandy to the heart of Nazi Germany, a road built by sacrifice, determination, and an enormous Allied military effort. And for the American soldiers who crossed that road, June 6, 1944, was more than a date on a calendar. It was the day they entered the fight that would carry them from the beaches of France to the German frontier, and ultimately to victory in Europe. World War II was the largest and most destructive conflict in history, resulting in approximately 55 million deaths worldwide. The conflict began on September 1st, 1939, with Germany's invasion of Poland, which triggered declarations of war from Great Britain and France. In the following years, the Axis powers, led by Nazi Germany, expanded across Europe and invaded the Soviet Union. However, key turning points, such as the Soviet victory at Stalingrad, the United States entry into the war following the attack on Pearl Harbor, and the Allied D-Day invasion, changed the course of the conflict. By 1945, Allied bombing raids had reduced German cities to rubble, and after Soviet troops reached Berlin, Adolf Hitler committed suicide, leading to Germany's unconditional surrender in May. The war officially ended on September 2nd, 1945, shortly after the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, forcing Japan's final surrender. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more content.